the end does come, that music should play as the background soundtrack. Do you agree? And that video is sobering, and at the same time, doesn't it encapsulate the tribulation that we live in, at least in the big events? And then, of course, as I said, we all have our own personal tribulation that we face. And so we're going to talk about how to overcome tribulation today. And in this series in Revelation, we're looking at how Revelation is always relevant. Of course, we have seen televangelists and read books who kind of use Revelation to predict the end of the world, and maybe they have a date, maybe they don't, and they sell books, and then that time kind of comes by or goes by, and the end didn't come, and so they just revise it and release a new book. And in times of turmoil, in times of chaos throughout history, Revelation has risen to the surface again. And then you think about the anxiety-producing events that we've been living through over the past few years. There's a war in Europe. There was a new threat from Turkey toward Greece this past week. I don't know if you saw that or not. Turkey is actually the setting of Revelation. We have inflation, a recession, depending on how you define it. We have ever-deepening political division in the United States. We have violent rhetoric. We have climate change. We have mass gun violence, and on and on and on. Propaganda on major channels in the United States, just spewing lies, and a great deal of uncertainty about the future. We don't know how the midterm elections are going to turn out, and then the effect that's going to have in 2024. And we've had rights taken away already, and we wonder how far that's going to go. And then on top of that, we have our personal struggles, things we prayed about in the prayer, ways that we need guidance, ways that we need clarity, ways that we need healing. Most of all, we probably need hope. And hope always comes as a surprise, doesn't it? As the saying goes, it's always darkest before the dawn. If you look back over your life, times when hope has broken in and you were able to see a new way forward, and that's what Revelation does. This ancient literature was about inspiring hope into people who were living in chaotic, difficult times. And so we're talking about the old familiar questions in Revelation, the mark of the beast next week, and the 144,000, and the return of Christ, the millennium, the war of Armageddon, and all these things. And yet we're also going to see how Revelation speaks in eerily relevant ways to our own personal lives. So today we're setting the stage for the rest of Revelation and the popular interpretation of the book, and then maybe some new ways of interpreting that maybe you haven't heard before. Today we're going to do an overview of chapters 6 through 11, and it's about this time called the Tribulation. And it includes the difficulties that the world goes through, and difficulties that we all go through. Now, this past Friday, both my sons attend the same school where my wife teaches, and they had a memorial service for 9/11, and my 6-year-old boy got to recite a poem. My youngest son, Grady, got to recite a poem in memorial for those who gave their lives in 9/11. I invited him to say it today, and he's like, there are too many adults here. It was easier when it was just kids. But he did a great job on Friday, and I was really proud of him. And it reminded me of the tribulation we live in, because both my sons take music lessons. My oldest son, Graham, takes guitar lessons. My youngest son, Grady, takes drum lessons. And they love to practice. I'm super thankful. And a lot of times they'll play along to songs on YouTube. So they'll look up the song on YouTube and then play their instruments to that. And now YouTube has a lot of commercials. If you're used to watching YouTube, you notice all the commercials. And now for us at least, they're all political commercials. Are you seeing these political commercials now? Wherever you live, I'm sure it's the same dynamic. So every time we get onto YouTube for them to play along to a song, it opens up with a political commercial. The other day, my 6-year-old quoted the political commercial. He's like, this is a religious sacrifice. You know, like he could quote like the script of the political commercial. I thought, oh, that's the time we're living in. When we see just these ridiculous commercials, and our children are even bombarded with that. And it just highlights the tribulation that we're all living in America. And of course, you don't wake up in the morning thinking about how to interpret Revelation. You wake up like I do, dealing with the things we all deal with, whether it's world events or whether it's our own personal issues and disappointment, breakup, relational issues, sickness, the loss of somebody we love, those strained relationships, financial stress, parenting stress, work stress, depression, anxiety, stuff from growing up that you haven't quite been able to heal from. Those are the things that we all wake up from. And so we're going to talk about those things and what Revelation has to say about those things. And we'll also answer some questions that thinking people ask about the Bible. Is God violent? Does God cause the suffering that we face? An old theology professor of mine posted this meme on his Facebook page. I wanted to show it to you. This is a Christian first date conversation, Christian dating icebreaker. So what do you think about violence in the Old Testament? I don't remember ever asking that question on my dates, but I suppose it happens. Today we're going to go even farther. We're going to talk about like a seminary professor first date question. What about violence in the New Testament? Because there's a great deal of violence in Revelation, and it seems like that God is the cause of all these things. Well, we'll talk about that question as well. We want to be a church where thinking people can take the Bible seriously when we interpret it in the light of its historical context. And many of us have questions about God and violence. And so in chapters 6 through 11, we read about what's commonly called the Great Tribulation. There are those who interpret Revelation as being fulfilled mostly in the past. They're called preterists, and they would point to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jewish temple in AD 70 by the Roman Empire as a time of great tribulation. Then in the 90s, under the Emperor Domitian, there was renewed persecution of Christians and other religious minorities, and that they believe would be the Great Tribulation. There are others who think that the Great Tribulation is something that will happen in the future, but I'm just going to read a few verses from chapter 6, and you're going to get an idea of the flavor of what this tribulation is about. Let's read. I watched as the Lamb, who is Jesus in Revelation, opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." And then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. Verse 7, when the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So you get a flavor for Revelation here. So the author of Revelation, John, lives in the Roman Empire, and he's writing to 7 churches that we talked about in chapter 1 who are being persecuted by the empire because they won't worship the Roman Emperor Domitian. They believe Jesus is Lord, not Caesar is Lord, and he's in what is now Turkey. And he's been exiled to an island called Patmos, about 37 miles off the coast of Turkey, and he's writing a letter back to these 7 churches that existed at that time in cities where we know they exist. And so he's writing a letter to people at that time and uses symbolism that we may not see in our time, but that would have made perfect sense to them. For example, of course, this passage is about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And the geopolitical enemies of the Romans were the Parthians or Persians, and they used horses in battles. I have a relief here. They were known as experts in mounted archery. Here's a Parthian archer on horseback. This relief is in northern Italy. And remember, we're living in a different time than Revelation. And so when a Roman citizen heard about horses and they have weapons, they're immediately going to think of the Parthians. This is a prophecy that means the Parthians are going to come and attack the Roman Empire. And so you can see how the original readers of this letter may have had a different automatic assumption than what some of us have had, that many of us have been taught this is always just about the future, or maybe that it's happening now, and America plays a role in Bible prophecy and so on. But this is probably who the first readers of Revelation would have thought of, and they would have certainly viewed this as a time of great suffering and tribulation if the Parthians attacked. And this was a way of saying God is going to bring judgment on the Roman Empire. And maybe that will come in the form of the Parthians attacking. And so they may have seen that as tribulation. So let's define it. Tribulation comes from a Greek word thlipsis, and it means affliction, trouble, distress, or anguish. It's used 43 times in the New Testament to refer to difficult experiences of all kinds. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul even says that if you get married, you'll experience tribulation. And here the four horsemen bring war, violence, inflation. That verse that we read about the rider with the scales and this many pounds of wheat for the day's wages, that refers to inflation, believe it or not. Scarcity, when the cost of food rose and food became less affordable. That's one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. All the economists say amen when they hear that. But that's the meaning of the passage. You can easily see why there has been a renewed interest in Revelation recently. They talk about disease. We've lived through a pandemic and inflation and death and war and political division. And you can see how Americans would read Revelation and think, oh man, this sounds like the time we're living in. And so just to bring you a little bit of peace of mind, my first point is a lot longer than 2 and 3. So while I'm on the first point for a while, don't think, oh man, we're going to be here all day. Like 2 and 3 are going to go quickly. But I want to start by saying this. And you might think this is obvious, but there's a point that needs to be made here. We can't escape tribulation in this world that we live in. We live in an unjust world. And it seems that, some of us try to go through life assuming that we can skirt around suffering in this life, that we can somehow avoid it, that we can escape it, that we can somehow run from suffering. And of course, we're not going to say it that way because it sounds foolish, because it doesn't work, but we still assume that it's possible. So there are those of us who will face suffering and then we choose to escape it through various ways of just trying to control our anxiety levels, addiction. This is where addiction comes from. It could be alcohol, it could be overspending, it could be all kinds of things. But we try to run from suffering by engaging in behaviors that essentially self-medicate and help us forget about our suffering. Now, if medication is prescribed by a doctor, excellent. We support medical science here. And there are times you need antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication and counseling. Those are all good things. But many of us, we tend to try to escape pain, tribulation that we deal with in life. Others, we just try to live in denial. We try to downplay it. We act like it's not a big deal. It's like if I don't talk about it, then it's not real. And so we try to avoid dealing with things that cause suffering. We avoid that awkward conversation that might actually help things in the relationship. We avoid making that decision. We procrastinate. We put it off, denying that that we're facing some kind of tribulation. It's a coping mechanism. And so some of us try to escape suffering in this life, but it's inescapable. And there are so many things that are causing tribulation for us personally and in our world that we have to deal with, that we have to decide with courage. No, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to speak out about what I see and what I think is right. We're living in a time that demands that. I was thinking about this recently. I talked with somebody who's a millennial here in the congregation, and she said, you think about everything that the millennial generation has been through, people in their 30s and early 40s, and been now through a recession in 2008, and it looks like another one, and student loan debt that is a political football, and then look at the cost of housing in a place like Phoenix over the past few years, where you had investment companies coming in and bidding up the price, and investors paying cash, and these millennial families got outbid out of a home, and then now they have to rent. But the rent's skyrocketed, and the rent's so high they can't afford a down payment. And even if they could afford a down payment, they'll just get outbid by the investor. And that sounds like the economy of the Roman Empire. That's the experience Jesus had, where it was a farming culture, but people had their farms taken from them, and they had to rent their farm back from the people who bought it. And it's unjust, and it creates tribulation, it creates suffering, and it destabilizes society. So there are people who realize, like in my home state of Ohio, it's called the Rust Belt, because their jobs have been shipped overseas, and they just don't do as well as their parents. And they feel that. And then a leader comes along who's a demagogue and says, well, it's all those people's fault. And they blame immigrants and people of color, and then all of a sudden there are people who fall for that. It's because of these forces of tribulation that have destabilized society, that created a vast inequity in America and suffering for people, where people can't get ahead, and the cost of health care and all these. We just go on and on and on and on. And then there are people who because of their tribulation, they try to escape by running into the arms of some political leader who promises he's going to fix it all and blames minority groups. And of course, that's ridiculous. But there are people who are hurting in their tribulation, and they want to believe that. And so you have 2022 America. But we can't escape tribulation in this life. And of course, like we said, there are different ways of interpreting Revelation. And how you interpret Revelation decides how you can learn from it when it comes to coping with tribulation in this life. What I'm going to do now is just kind of describe the most popular version we've heard, and then whether that really helps us to cope with tribulation or not. And it's the futurist view that believes that everything in Revelation is going to happen in the future. And so there are people who make themselves even theologically believe that they can escape tribulation. So during the summer after my freshman year, I made a youthful mistake, and I decided to work on the campus cleaning crew at my college. That means I had to clean the freshman dorms. Bad mistake. That was the folly of youth. I decided that I wanted to be on the cleaning crew, and when you're cleaning the guy's freshman dorm, you're basically conducting science experiments on fungus. Like, oh, that's what happens when that's allowed to grow for years and years and years. Or this is totally serious. Oh, that's what happens when you don't flush your urinal for 7 days. Wow. Okay, that was my decision to work on the campus cleaning crew after freshman year, and so I had this cool team of other students that I worked with, and really appreciated relationships with them. One of the guys went on to be in commercials, and he was like a UPS commercials, and for years his photo was in Staples, I remember, as like the UPS guy. And another guy was gay at a Christian college, and I got to hear a little bit about his experience as a gay Christian going to a Christian college that didn't allow that. And so it was a great experience in some ways. One of the not so great ones was the head of the cleaning crew was this huge Bible prophecy buff. And so he was always talking about the end that was coming in. This was in the mid-90s. And so what year was coming up that people were freaking about? The year 2000. You guys remember Y2K? Some of you do. Some are like, no, Ryan, you're old. I don't remember Y2K. But some of you do. When the computers were supposed to mess up, and so man, this guy was into Bible prophecy. He was like, Ezekiel 38 and 39 and Revelation 20 says Russia will attack Israel. He had it all planned out, and the rapture's right around the corner. I'm telling you, the Lord's coming back, Jesus is coming, the rapture's coming, Jesus is coming back. And as if you just asked him, what's for lunch? Like, when are we getting lunch today? He would just go off on these Bible prophecy tangents, and I would think, if Jesus is coming back so soon, do we really have to clean the dorms this well? They've been dirty for a long time. Can't they just wait a couple more years till Y2K and the rapture? And so he loved Bible prophecy. And this was his view, the futurist view. And I want to show you a chart. And you could see this chart probably in a lot of Christian TV shows. If you read the Left Behind series, which is the #1 selling Christian book series in history, 65 million copies, this is what you would see. And here's the word of the day. Like I said a few weeks ago, I used to watch Sesame Street when I was a kid, and they had the word of the day, but it would be like 7 or blue. Here's the word of the day for us. Get ready for this. Everybody ready? Pre-Millennial Dispensationalism. How's that for a word of the day? And so premillennial dispensationalism, it is the popular view of Revelation in America. And it does have profound meaning for how Revelation speaks to us in our own suffering. Please, that's what we're talking about today. I know it's kind of a theology tangent, but we're talking about the stuff that you're going through. All right, so premillennial dispensationalism, here's the cross. Jesus comes, he teaches, he dies on the cross, he raises from the dead. And we're living in the church age now. And then at some point in the future, my boss there and the cleaning crew believed that there would be a secret rapture when all of the sudden people who are followers of Jesus just disappear. They're snatched up by God and they just like disappear. Like they just fall out of their clothing, falls to the ground. They're driving and there's no driver in the car anymore. And so you've seen that maybe in the Left Behind movies. Nick Cage was in a Left Behind movie in 2014. I mean, that's how popular this stuff is. And so there's the secret rapture when all the followers of Jesus just poof, disappear. And then you have the period of the tribulation in Revelation 6 through 11, the Great Tribulation. That's followed by the second coming of Christ, and then the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and then the last judgment. So in premillennial dispensationalism, what happens before the tribulation? The secret rapture. And so followers of Jesus don't go through the Great Tribulation. The plan is essentially escape from the Great Tribulation. Now, if you hold to premillennial dispensationalism, welcome to the well. You're as welcome here as anybody else is. I have some questions about premillennial dispensationalism. It is a relatively new interpretation of Revelation in Christian history. It was proposed in the 1830s by an English lawyer named John Nelson Darby, who began teaching a home Bible study in Plymouth, England, and he taught that throughout the Bible, God has related to humans in 7 different ways he called dispensations, and it caught on in America just after the Civil War. And you can see why in the chaos of American society at that time. But this view of the end comes from John Nelson Darby, relatively new in Christian history. It was popularized by the Schofield Reference Bible. It became very popular in America in the early 1900s. And so they believe that Revelation is primarily about the future. Now remember, Revelation is an actual letter that was sent to 7 churches that existed at that time. And so if Revelation is only about the future, it would be like sending a letter to somebody and saying, oh, but this has nothing to do with you. This is just later. And so that raises questions about the solely futurist view. And now maybe these folks are right, but I don't find scriptural support for the secret rapture. If you do, that's fine. I've had lots of conversations over the past 20, 25 years with people about that. I just don't find a lot of scriptural support for it. But for me, the secret rapture is kind of an escape plan from tribulation in this life. And I find that I don't know that that's helpful to me when it comes to coping with tribulation that I experience in this life, because it doesn't fit my experience of how to deal with tribulation. And so maybe the chart would look something like this. If we say, and Caleb, you can skip ahead a couple of slides, to where we have Jesus and the cross and the resurrection, and then at some point we have tribulation. Now maybe that's something in the future, or maybe Revelation is eternally relevant. It's relevant in every generation. And maybe there will be some future event where it's the Great Tribulation like this. I'm not saying that's not the case. But it may also be that the way we interpret Revelation and the way that it can best speak to us as followers of Jesus is that it maybe has something to do with the future, and maybe the past, and maybe every generation. So that we live in a time of goodness in the world, good things are happening in the world, and we live in a time of tribulation to some degree, whether it's the quote-unquote Great Tribulation, or if it's the kind of tribulation that America is going through right now that sounds a lot like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And so for me, just theologically, I wanted to make the point that there are different views of this, and the secret rapture, kind of the escape plan from Revelation. That's one view of Revelation. But it may be that there isn't really an escape plan from tribulation in life, but there's another way that God helps us to cope with the tribulation of life, the anguish, the affliction, the distress, the suffering that we all face. Another way I think Revelation helps us to see suffering in a new way is to see your tribulation in perspective relative to what others face. Maybe we can't escape tribulation, and it's something else we can do now is to see it in a different perspective. When we're hurting, and I don't know if this describes you, but I know I'm like this, we tend to be consumed with our own pain. We tend to ruminate on what's happened to us and replay it over and over again in our minds, and maybe we try to understand what happened, or maybe we think if we just keep replaying it, it'll somehow make it better, and we replay over and over again what hurt us, and we may want revenge. We can become even more depressed, and once again, I'm not stigmatizing depression and anxiety that are real issues that should be treated with medical science. We don't stigmatize that here. But sometimes we can get so lost in our own thoughts and in our own pain that we lose perspective on our lives and we're not able to see clearly. And so in chapters 6 through 11, we have the apocalypse and all these things unleashed on the earth, and war and violence and the seven trumpets and plagues and suffering and hailfire mixed with blood, and a third of humankind is killed, and we're only halfway through, And chapter 11 reads like it could be the end of of everything, the end of days. And then in chapter 12, it circles back. And so there's some that think Revelation might actually replay the same events several different times. But we see here great suffering. And we see the context of Revelation is this letter was sent to Christians who were being literally killed for their faith, or who were being shut out of the economic system because of their faith, and they were starving. They were watching their children starve. And according to globalcitizen.com, there are at least 27 live conflicts right now in the world. Wars. Obviously, Ukraine gets the media attention here, but political instability in Lebanon, the war in Yemen, instability in Afghanistan, the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, the conflict in Ethiopia. There are people who live with the constant threat that a bomb will fall on them. There are people watching their children die of starvation right now. Over the past decade in Syria, 100,000 Syrians were killed in a civil war, where the human rights violations are just staggering. And there are people fleeing their home countries in Central America. And they're rushing to our border to seek asylum from the violence, from cartels and so on. And so much of the world lives in the kind of suffering right now that we see described in Revelation, where their lives are threatened, their economic necessities are not met, and the suffering that causes. And what that does for me is it helps me to see my own problems, my own tribulation in perspective. Now, another question that raises for thinking people who want to follow Jesus is God violent? When we read about all these things, is God the cause somehow of all this suffering? And I just want to say quickly as a tangent, and we'll move on. When you read pictures in Revelation about the judgment of God, it doesn't necessarily mean that God is causing that in real life. It's symbolic language. It's a way of saying all of this is happening because of the violence and the injustice in the world. When you live like this as a planet, the world starts to come apart at the seams. So you think about some of the suffering going on in our lives right now. Inflation. Did God cause inflation? I've not seen that on CNBC. I don't see God as the cause of inflation. What's inflation caused by? It's caused by greed, it's caused by political decisions, it's caused by all kinds of economic forces that get complex. It's not God causing inflation, but inflation is one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And scarcity and famine. But is God really the cause of those things? Well, I don't think so. Is God the cause of political violence? Did God command people to fly airplanes into buildings on 9/11? I'm going to go with no. Now, were there religious motivations? Yes. And political motivations and economic motivations? Yes. Do you think some supreme being actually told those hijackers to do that? What's your answer? No. So does God cause these things that we read about? No, of course not. It's a way of saying these things come upon the world as a judgment for our choices. And I had an awesome conversation with my oldest son this morning. We were on our way here to serve on road crew, and he was talking about 9/11. And I said, we all have the ability to make choices in our life about whether we do good things or bad things. And if we feel slighted, if we feel hurt when we suffer, we can choose how we're going to respond. And so sometimes people make choices that just perpetuate the violence and the injustice and the nastiness and the inequities. And then society starts to come apart at the seams. And what we need is for good people to stand up. And I want my sons to be those good people. They're good young guys. And I want them to grow up as young men who will stand up and make their voice counted for what's right. And that we can choose a better way. It doesn't mean that God is causing these things. The things that are happening in our world are consequences of our decisions. But we can see our own suffering in perspective when we look at the suffering of other people. And I don't mean this to minimize anything that anybody is going through. Because for some of you, you are facing some of the most difficult experiences of your life. You've lost somebody you love. You've gotten a diagnosis that nobody would want to get. You're dealing with relationship problems or broken relationships that nobody would want to go through. I have friends who lost a 6-year-old son to cancer. I mean, just the hell of hells. There's nothing worse than that. And so it doesn't minimize anything that anybody is going through. But one of the things that I take away from a passage like this, when I think about my own tribulation, I think about things that are happening in my life that are causing me pain that I wish were different. And there are times I'll look at somebody else's life and I'll say, you know what, they're going through something that's worse than what I'm going through. I'm not losing my child to cancer, thankfully. And so I want to be thankful for that. And, I'm not in Afghanistan right now, wondering what in the world's going to happen to me next. I'm not in Ukraine right now, getting a bomb dropped on me. I'm not in Yemen, watching my children starve to death. And so, once again, I don't mean that to minimize anybody's suffering, because for some of you, maybe you are going through the ultimate suffering, tribulation. But what I try to do is to see my suffering in perspective because of passages like this, and ask, wait a second, what can I be thankful for? What are the ways that I can look for God working in my tribulation? I can't escape it, so that's not the right way. Now, how can I see God working in my tribulation? Not that God caused it, but to bring good things out of it. So actually, the series that we're going into after Revelation, we're going to talk about growth. It's called Growth Track, actually, starting on October 2nd. We're going to start a new 4-week series about how to grow as a follower of Jesus at the well. We'll talk about belonging as a member of the body of Christ, being a body part of the body of Christ. We'll talk about growing to become your best self, growing to become the person God created you to be, reaching your potential as a person, discovering your purpose in this world. And then what it looks like to partner with God to make a difference with your life. And one of the most important ways we can grow as a person is by understanding how to overcome tribulation and how to get involved and discover purpose and serve people who are hurting. And we can see our own pain in perspective, not just lost and consumed by our own pain and isolated, but we can get outside of ourselves and serve and see our suffering in perspective, and that can be a part of our healing process. Another way of doing that, this is the last day to sign up for the Border Connection trip. We have a trip coming up on October 1st and the 22nd, 2 identical trips down to Nogales, Mexico. And we're going to visit an organization there that serves people who are asylum seekers, who are fleeing violence in their homeland. And of course, those people are used as a political football in the United States. We'll get to meet people who are seeking asylum at the border and hear their stories. You can sign up at the back of the room there at the name tag table after the service today. But serving like that is a way to see your suffering, your tribulation in perspective. Lastly, another way to do that is to get in relationships with other people where you can encourage each other, where you can vent to each other and also challenge and encourage each other in a small group. So our current Connect group is wrapping up this Wednesday by welcoming the author of the book they've been discussing, Keith Giles. And anybody in church is invited. You can go to wellchurch.org to get that Zoom link for Wednesday night. And they've been discussing a book called Jesus Unarmed, about making peace. And you can check that out. But then we're launching new Connect groups in October. 3 new groups starting around the first or second week of October. And right now there are about 20 people who have been involved in Connect groups at the Well. I'd love to double that or more. I'd love to make it 40 or 50. And so if you've never tried a Connect group, they're 6 weeks long, groups of maybe 6, 10, 15 people who get together either in person or online and discuss a study topic and just talk about, here's what my week was like for 30 seconds and just kind of build relationships with people. And you don't have to walk through life alone. It's about community and building new friendships with people here at the Well. You can get info about those at wellchurch.org and in my weekly email. But those are just some of the ways that we can see our own tribulation in perspective. We can't escape it, but we can see it in perspective by choosing to grow. How can I grow out of this? How can I serve? How can I get outside of myself and make somebody else's life better? And how can I build relationships with people where I can be honest about what I'm going through and I can hear what they're going through and we can encourage each other as we grow. And then last point, and this is probably the hardest. When we face tribulation in this life, what does Revelation say to us? It says we can choose to trust that God is able to empower you to overcome tribulation. I use that word choose on purpose. You can choose to trust that God is able to empower you to overcome tribulation. That word choose is a powerful word, isn't it? Because when everything else is kind of stripped away and you are facing tribulation in your life, ultimately you're left with a choice. Okay, I can't escape this. Maybe I try to see it from a different perspective or maybe not. But ultimately you choose, is this going to be it for me? Am I going to be defeated and left for dead here by this tribulation and never be the same again? Or is there some way that I can get up and put one foot in front of the other and I can somehow make it through this? I can't escape it. And maybe you choose to see another person's perspective or maybe you don't. But ultimately, it comes down to a choice. Am I going to make it through this or not? To choose, to decide, one of the hallmark songs of the civil rights era. At an ugly time when there are so many marchers who are being literally beaten and bloodied for standing up for the right thing. One of the most popular songs was "We Shall Overcome." And at the end, in one of the refrains, someday, we shall overcome. Man, that's the ultimate example. There comes a point where if you're being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you make a choice. And I'm standing up for the right thing here, I'm doing the right thing, and I'm suffering for it. I've made my opinion known. I've said, I see what's happening here and it's not right, and I'm going to stand up and I'm going to be counted. And there are consequences for that. There are people who are committing evil acts in this world and they don't like to be stood up to. And in a time like that, you have the choice about whether you're going to sing "We Shall Overcome." Are we going to lose? Are we going to give up? Or are we going to overcome? Even if it's someday, it's a song of hope, but it's a decision. It's a choice. In Revelation 7, we read about the famous 144,000 who are saved, and there are lots of different interpretations about that, of course, but 144,000 is a symbolic number. It's 12,000 people from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Say that 3 times fast. 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel. And it might stand for all people who are faithful to God. People who believe Revelation was fulfilled in the first century believe that these were Jewish people who survived the Roman attack. And they had the diaspora. They went to all these different countries and survived. But a few verses later, John speaks of an uncountable multitude of people from every people group who had been faithful to God through the tribulation. And now their time of suffering is over. And maybe to the churches like Philadelphia and Smyrna, 2 of the 7 churches this letter was written to, who were poor and hungry and suffering, maybe it was a way of saying to them, you're going to be in this multitude. It doesn't feel like that now. Your tribulation seems like it's all consuming right now. You're suffering, but it's not how things are going to end up. We shall overcome someday. And you're going to be standing in this multitude of people who have overcome tribulation because God has empowered you to do it. And if you're faithful to God and you do the right thing, don't try to escape. Serve people, grow, see your suffering in perspective. Partner with God to let God bring good things out of your life, even out of the suffering of your life. Don't give up. And choose to let God empower you to overcome. You can stand with that uncountable number. What does that look like without the sci-fi symbolism of Revelation? Another college story for you. When I was in college, I also worked at, the cleaning crew. I learned my lesson over that one summer. I didn't work in the cleaning crew anymore. I got a job in a store in the town, and one of my coworkers was a lady named Judy. And at that time, she was in her late 50s. She was a sweet, kind lady. She had seen more of her fair share of troubles in life. Years before, her husband had left her to raise 3 kids. He didn't have any contact with them. She had a daughter and 2 sons. One of her sons died in his 30s from complications due to AIDS. This is in the late 80s, early 90s when that happened, at a time when AIDS was basically a death sentence. He actually died soon after he was baptized in a church that didn't really allow him to be a part of the church, but he decided that he wanted to proclaim his faith in Jesus and be baptized in that church. And so she lost her son, and she worked in this little store. She didn't have any health insurance. She was a few years away from Medicare, and I remember thinking, man, if she gets sick, she'll be saddled with debt for the rest of her life. It's just a tough place to be, and she was struggling financially, of course, and she let me stay at her place over Christmas break one year so I could still work and not go back where my parents lived a couple hours away, and so appreciated that. We got to interact a little bit, and I was a religion major in college, and she knew that, and one night I was sitting in the living room watching TV, and Billy Graham was on TV, and I know some of you may have different feelings about him, but obviously extremely popular spiritual figure in America at that time. And she came in and she sat down just a few feet away and watched his sermon. And I looked over and noticed while she was watching his sermon, tears were just streaming down her face. And he wasn't necessarily saying anything, I don't directly applicable, but there was something about that environment that was cathartic for her. Whatever that meant to her, and tears were streaming down her face. Like in that kind of spiritual environment, she felt permission to let go, to let the dam break. And she was being quiet. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't. But tears were just streaming down her face. And sometimes the store would be so busy we didn't have a whole lot of time to talk, but sometimes in between customers, I would ask her about her life and how she was doing, especially after that. And more than once, she would tell me her story, and then she would say something like, you know what? You just learn through life that this is happening. Some things are out of my control. Some things are under my control. And you put one foot in front of the other, and somehow you make it. Lost a son, facing financial hardship. You just decide to put one foot in front of the other, and you make it. She's a survivor. She's the kind of person who chooses to let God work in her life, who chooses good, who chooses to not grow bitter and consumed in her own pain, but who was still a pleasant person and a nice person and who was open to life. And she was the kind of person that ends up in that 144,000 or that uncountable multitude, waving palm branches, which are Jewish symbols for surviving and being victorious after a battle. It's a way of saying God brought us through. We made it. We've overcome. Even in this tribulation, even in this unjust system, even though things that have happened to me that were unfair, we made it. We have overcome. And what if the Great Tribulation, maybe it is something that happens in the future. There are different views. But what if it's also representative of all tribulation in life? And we can take something from that. No, we can't escape tribulation. We can choose to see it from another perspective, to grow, to serve. And we can make the ultimate choice that we're not going to be defeated by this, that we can overcome. The last scripture I want to read, Revelation chapter 7. Here's what it says about people who overcome the Great Tribulation. The last part is a quote from Isaiah 25 in the Old Testament. Then one of the elders asked me, "These in white robes, who are they and where did they come from?" I answered, "Sir, you know." And he said, "These are they who have come out of the Great Tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him night and day in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Never again will they hunger. Never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb, Jesus, at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. We shall overcome someday. And whatever tribulation you're facing, some of us go through life denying that we're really suffering, or we're trying to escape suffering, or we live in anxiety and fear that we can't handle the tribulation of life. And here's the message of Revelation. You are going to experience tribulation in this life, and you can overcome it. That's the message of Revelation. It's not escapism, it's not denial, it's not living in fear and anxiety. You are going to experience tribulation, but here's the good news. You can overcome it. That's the message of Revelation. It's realism and hope, that you don't have to live in fear. And so this is an inspirational picture to me. A picture of hope, a picture of overcoming whatever our tribulation means. We don't try to escape it. We don't deny it. We don't want to get consumed in our own pain. But we can ask, how can I grow here? God didn't cause this. But how can God empower me to grow? How can I serve other people? How can I get outside of myself? How can I partner with God to make the world a better place? And I can make the choice that God can empower me to overcome. Let's pray. God, thank you for this scripture that speaks realistically and honestly to those of us who are suffering. It's not denial. It's not escapism. It's not saying, oh, it wasn't so bad. No, some of us are hurting in horrible ways. And God, so many people in our culture try to escape through addiction, through revenge, thinking that'll help, or just not dealing with problems, sweeping them under the rug, pretending they don't exist. That doesn't work. What works, God, is seeing our suffering from a new perspective, your perspective. What I'm going through is real. It's real suffering. The tribulation's real. But I can choose to see it in perspective. I can choose to grow. I can choose to allow you to work in my life. I can get into community, a connect group. I can serve other people in the Border Connection or other ministries. I can just get involved in allowing you to work through me to make other people's lives better and not be consumed with my own pain. And then ultimately, God, I have the faith choice, the trust choice. I can choose to believe that you can empower me and that I can overcome, that we can overcome. When we do the right thing, we can overcome. God, thank you that in the time we live in, here in the fall of 2022, when we don't know what the future holds, oh God, we can overcome tribulation and in our own personal lives. And we thank you that your Spirit empowers us to overcome. In Jesus' name, everybody said,